Good morning. I would like to thank everybody for letting me come and speak to you today. And last night and this morning, I've had a great chance to speak to a lot of you who are the inventors or the members of the different institutions. And like Joe, DFJ Mercury is a very early seed stage venture fund. We like to invest in technologies as early as possible. And that, in fact, is where Glykos Biotechnologies came about. We actually founded the company, licensed the technology from Rice University, put the team together, and right now we have about 12 members working in the company about 15 minutes away from here. So we like to work very early. That being said, one of the things that we've had to do a couple of different times is work with different tech transfer offices. And while I am not going to claim to be an expert, and I will always tell you to try to find a really good licensing attorney to work with you and help you through these deals. And no, that's not necessarily a plug for Bill who just left. Just find a good licensing attorney. You still at some level have to interact with the tech transfer office. And if you are an investigator who is starting a company on their own, you know, you're kind of on both sides of the fence all of a sudden, because you were the guy who created the IP inside the institution, and now you're outside the institution. So you're sitting on both sides of the fence, and you're trying to come to some sort of an agreement. And, you know, that poses its challenges, but there's just ways to work through it. I basically wanted to break this down into just a couple of different areas and hope I can give you some advice on how to get through different situations. The first one is really, you got to remember you're negotiating. And in science, normally, you look at data and you say it's black or white, or you can interpret data, but you're looking at facts and you're able to interpret it. In working with the tech transfer office, you really are negotiating with them. And down at the bottom, I list a book here that's called Getting to Yes. This is kind of like mandatory reading for all MBAs, and it's one of the few MBA-type books I would ever really recommend to anybody, because it helps you kind of understand what negotiations really is. This is not a zero-sum game where one side takes, the other has to give it up, and no one, only one side can benefit. In the end, what we're trying to do is get both sides to benefit at the same time. Now, the difficulty is that each side is motivated differently. You each have different objectives. From the point of view of the company, what you're trying to do is reach a license agreement that is economically viable. You need to have terms in the contract that you can live with when you bring a product to market. And if you're a startup company, there's a lot of things you may not know going into the agreement that might affect how you would like the terms to be later on. And so hopefully we can address a couple of those issues and what's going on there. The tech transfer office is on the other side of the table. They are university administrators at some level. Most all of them are really nice people who are trying to help the faculty. They are nice people. They're trying to help the faculty do their job right, and they're trying to protect the rights of the university to this intellectual property that's been created. And it doesn't really matter if it's a patent or a copyright. Whatever the form of the intellectual property is, if the university has rights to it, you're going to have to go through the tech transfer office and deal with them. But the responsibilities of the tech transfer office really do vary from institution to institution. So the whole idea is we just need to keep the faculty members happy, and as long as it's ethical and passes the ethical standards of the university, we can get agreements done very quickly. In some places, we're supposed to extract every last pound of flesh from the company, and sometimes terms get a little skewed, and if you're not aware of what your business model may be later on, that can be a big problem. So one thing that really helps is to try to talk to others who might have worked with your tech transfer office and work with them to try to figure out the right strategy to go after. So you got to remember why you're actually talking to the transfer office. You kind of have to. If you're going to start a company based on your technology, if you have no rights to that technology, you really don't have a company. And as an investor, we sometimes will invest in companies that are not necessarily patent-protected technologies, but if there's patents out there that you have to have freedom to operate for your business to run and be financially viable, if you don't have those, that's a really, really big issue. So you need to work with the university and try to figure out some way of negotiating that IP into your firm. The type of licensing, the stage of the company and the type of license you're looking for really will affect the economic terms and how you deal with the university. So if you are a startup and you are the inventor of the technology or the investigator and you are licensing your own technology back from the institution, usually that is the core founding IP. And so a lot of times that affects how much you have to give and take. One of my favorite examples is in this type of situation, you're probably going to have to give up some sort of equity to the university. That way, the university can benefit to a greater extent than just a royalty. So if your company sells for $800 million, they participate in that as well. And that goes back to the question of, do we want to make you rich? Well, yeah. So if your company sells for $800 million, we hope that that is a meaningful, life-changing event for you. And you have to think about that now. Now that you're representing the company, every little bit of equity you give up will affect what happens later on. But if you're just trying to license this IP for the first time, you might have to give up some of that equity. And at this stage of the game, it can be very precious currency. If you're kind of a going concern, or think of it as you've already licensed your first set of IP from the university, and there's some additional IP that you need either from your university or from another one, you're kind of in a different position. You're a going concern now, and there should technically be less risk in the company. This IP that you're looking for is just a small fraction. It's one step that might be enabling, and you might actually have a couple different options of how to accomplish the same technical objective without necessarily having that piece of IP. You could use a different method to achieve the same results. And that'll affect how you work with the tech transfer office. You might ask for a non-exclusive license. And I can think of a couple of different examples in the industrial biotech space where I've been working, where one university has a patent around a really key gene. But it's just one step in a process. But it's one step in a whole bunch of different processes. So the university took the strategy that they were going to give a non-exclusive license. In this case, this single piece of IP really is not enough to set up a company. You need to think of what makes a whole company viable. But it can be a great part of a whole bunch of different companies. And so they are willing to give non-exclusive licenses. And if you go in and keep on demanding an exclusive license, you'll go nowhere. But the other thing is that the type of license that they're going to grant you does affect the economics of the deal. So if they're going to give you a non-exclusive license, you would expect to pay a much smaller royalty or have different upfront negotiation fees or economics associated with the deal. So kind of think of the different levers that are being worked in this machine and realize that if they're giving you more, they're going to ask for more. If they're giving you less, you should be willing to pay less. And the reason I keep harping on this is because the licensing deals, how you set up this license really can affect your company going into the future, way beyond just the 6 months, or if you're lucky, or 18 months if you're unlucky, of dealing with the tech transfer office. There's a lot of one-time payments that are included. I don't know how many of you have ever looked at a license agreement with the university, but there's a lot of different fees that they throw in there. And you kind of have to work with them to try to make those fees reasonable and know how those fees will affect your business. So a couple of the one-time fees you might pay is just, if you're taking out a short option for your technology, an exclusivity period, where you may put up $2,500 or $5,000 or some small amount of cash, so that you, for a period of time, have exclusive negotiation rights for your intellectual property. You might say, well, why do I have to do that? Well, you want the university to be dealing with you in good faith, but if you're going to tie up their technology for a long period of time, they want money. But you got to think about whether or not you need to do that and what that money is going to cost you. Other fees that they'll come back and ask you to pay include, they'll want you to pay for all the patent prosecution expenses, for example. And I don't know how many of you have talked with your tech transfer offices about the bills for your patents, but it can be really high. If you're just doing a domestic patent here in the US and they're using a top-tier law firm, It might be $20,000, $25,000. But if you have gone into any of your international type patenting situations, PCT filings, it can be $50,000 and up. And if you actually have 2 or 3 pieces of intellectual property that you're trying to pile together, that becomes a very big number very quickly. So be aware that they might ask you to pay for those as well. And yes, you can agree to pay them, but then on the other side you can offer to pay in a tiered schedule. In other words, you might pay a certain amount up front and then over time pay off the rest of it, so that you're not asking your investors or your partners to give you money that you then literally hand over to the university, and there's no money left in the company to actually try to move the company forward. So you try to spread those payments out over time. The other big ticket item that I think it causes a lot of heartache in negotiations is the royalty structure that you'll end up paying. And one kind of useful technique that I've worked on, and I'm not going to guarantee that it works every time, is first thing is try to negotiate the structure of the deal without necessarily attacking the economics. And so in a license agreement that I'm working on right now, we've talked in general terms of kind of like what the royalty might be, but nobody's really put anything on paper. What we've worked on is making sure we understand what the different rights and responsibilities are, what milestones the company has to hit in order to maintain the rights to the intellectual property. You know, we have to show that we commercialize it within a certain period of time. Those types of agreements are very important. But if you negotiate those first, then you get all the bulk of it out of the way, and then you get down to the last little bit that's going to be the royalty part. And that helps because both sides have developed a level of trust during these negotiations, and hopefully both sides have begun to kind of hone in on a number. And then when you sit down to discuss it, each side won't throw out a number that's wildly unrealistic. So I've actually seen one company that was going to produce what would basically be an industrial product have a license from a university with a 10% royalty. But is that really reasonable? Well, if you think about a lot of industrial products, especially a lot of the chemical companies and the big companies that you see, they make net income percentages of around 10 to 20%. And if 10% is your royalty, and that happens to be your net income too, you basically have given away 100% of the economic life of your company to the university. You may own 99.9% of the equity, but you really don't own the economic benefits to the company at some level. So you have to make sure that the royalty is reasonable for your industry and reasonable for your business model. And the only way to do that is to go out and do research. This isn't just sitting down with a pencil and paper and just flipping it back and forth. I really recommend that you go out, you find information in the literature, you talk to different licensing groups or other people who've participated in these types of activities, and try to get input from them on both what's reasonable and what or customary in your industry, and how you might work around the different types of numbers. Understanding your business model is really important. Back to my industrial biotech example, what are you really selling? Well, it depends on what you want to do. If you're a company that plans on developing a new bug that makes a chemical like Amyris or LS9 or Gevos, a lot of these clean tech companies that you may have heard about coming out of California, if you're going to go from soup to nuts, somebody sells you the raw sugar that comes in the front of the plant and you're selling a chemical that comes out of the back, that's one business model. But what if you're a partner with a big industrial player where you actually sell them the bugs that they put in the tank to carry out the process? That's a separate business model. You're selling bugs, you're not selling chemicals, and your royalty structure will be very different. Those are the types of things you need to think about as early as possible. Now, the hard part comes in that your business model may change. And in every startup, in fact, your whole point for being in business may change over the first couple of years. And that sounds kind of strange, but you'll figure out that your technology has a really core value, but it may be the first market you were trying to address isn't the best market, and it may be a different market, and you may need a different business model. And this goes back to the comments earlier of, are you selling a piece of capital equipment, or are you selling it on a per-use basis? And these types of business model implications can really affect your royalty structure as well. But the most important part here goes back to the beginning. you really need to communicate with the tech transfer office as openly as possible. You don't need to give away the farm. That's not my point. But when you are negotiating a deal, you need to say, well, look, here's why a particular royalty structure or a particular term causes you problems inside the company. It creates a situation where either you really can't defend yourself in the marketplace, or you're giving away so much money that you'll never get funding from your venture sources, which is a legitimate reason to go back to your tech transfer office with. Situations like that where you just sit down, you openly talk with them, and you provide them as much documentary evidence as possible to support your position really will help. And they'll listen. They're reasonable people, but you are the experts in this field, and chances are you probably know more about the markets even as a scientist or an investigator. And the reason I say you probably know more about the markets, even though that's not your specialty, is you got to remember that the tech transfer office, each person, I want to call them a caseworker, but that's not exactly what it is. Each person in the tech transfer office works with how many different pieces or different patent portfolios for different investigators. If it's a small office, you may have 2 people and they may have 30 or 40. But some of the bigger offices here in town can have a couple of hundred investigators working with them. So each individual may be working on 40, 50, or 60 different pieces of intellectual property. And they're supposed to know both, the IP, the markets. You can start seeing how you throw on different factors and all of a sudden they're just completely overwhelmed and unable to get the information they need to support the agreement when they go talk to their boss to get it signed off on. And to the extent that you can provide them as much information and justification as possible, you relieve them from the burden of writing all these, going out and researching and finding and writing up documents in this space. It makes the deal easier and it should make it go faster. So there are a lot of one thing I'll come back to in a minute, but there are a lot of non-economic factors that are really important here too. And I put personal interactions up at the top because there have been instances where I've dealt with the tech transfer office and it was clear we just didn't click. We weren't the right personality, so maybe inside the company I wasn't the right person to be representing the company to do the negotiations. Well, fine. Hopefully there's one other person or 2 other people in your group that you can get to interact on your behalf. Maybe it's an attorney, which can be an expensive way to go about doing it, but it may be a very appropriate way of going about. But you need to realize that sometimes personalities just don't click, and you shouldn't let that get in the way of getting a deal done. You should find some way to get around it. And I wrote technologist versus administrator up here for a reason, and that's because they're really different personality types. They have a hard time sometimes communicating in the same language, and it's a communications barrier that keeps them from clicking. So finding someone who has common ground with the people in the tech transfer office can be very helpful. Another thing that they like to stick into license agreements are due diligence milestones, or things that you have to do that may not necessarily be dollars back to the university, but if you don't accomplish them, the university can pull back the license. And so some of them are kind of trivial. They're not necessarily going to pull back the license and it's easily cured, but it's a headache. A business plan. Well, if you write a business plan for the tech transfer office, it's kind of nice for them to know what you are going to do with their technology. I agree with that completely. But at some level, spelling it out in too much detail is not necessarily very helpful to them or to you because, well, do you want feedback from them on where your business should be going? That's not their job. Your job is to go figure out where your business is supposed to be going, working with your investors to figure out what you want to do. The commercialization plan and timeline is pretty important. Don't agree to unreasonable terms. If you are working on a therapeutic, do not agree to be in clinical trials within 18 months or to be through your preclinical toxicology studies in that period of time. Know what's kind of typical for your industry and then add a fudge factor. And they should be willing to accept that. And if they start saying, no, it needs to be shorter, go back with information that says, well, usually it takes this long to go through clinical, preclinical trials, toxicology studies. that can actually be a kind of a tight problem. And it goes back to something I was going to say in the last slide, which is a lot of times when you have this commercialization plan, you do have some milestone payments tied back in to the university. So if you accomplish certain steps in your commercialization plan, you kick back $50,000. Well, what if that step, that milestone, is when you're ready to launch your product and take it to market? All of a sudden, you've lost $50,000 in your company that could go to moving the business forward. Maybe there's some way for you to work around that. Instead of giving up money at the moment you need it most, you can work with the university and say, well, we can make sure you get that money, but it needs to be 6 months or 8 months after your first commercial sale, just so that you don't end up in a situation where you've got lots of great sales and no working capital to actually fund your company. So something to think about. Choice of IP counsel is another thing that has come back to bite me once or twice. University likes to use their counsel, and that's very appropriate, especially when they're the only ones working on the intellectual property. And if you're just licensing a finished piece, an issued patent, then the university counsel is the one who did it, and you don't have to worry about this. But if you're working on patents that are still in prosecution, sometimes the university counsel is kind of like the Rolls-Royce of IP counsel, and they can be fairly pricey. And sometimes they're not necessarily the best people to be working with. You would like to have IP counsel that is really, at some level, a domain expert, someone who's really spent a lot of time working in your technology field so that they really understand the invention and how it fits into the prior art and draft you a good patent, good claim set. So the choice of your counsel and how much they charge you can come back to bite you later. In our case, I've seen some examples of different university counsels that are, they're great people, they do a really good job, but the bills are starting to mount up, and that gets to be really painful. And if you're working with a smaller law firm that you know better, usually you can have a lower fee and also negotiate a payment schedule that works to your benefit. Another thing to include is rights to improvements. And sometimes inside the university lab, the faculty member keeps on working on what he's been doing. You need to make sure that you include that you have the right to everything you develop inside the university after you sign that license agreement that has to do with the same set of intellectual property. It may not give you access to other people's intellectual or new projects, the intellectual property to new projects, but it will at least keep you from creating something better that then somebody can say, oh no, you can't do that. It's a tough place to be. And I think, yep, that was pretty much what I wanted to cover today. And I hope you guys understand that it's a fun experience trying to license technology the first time. And just don't be afraid to ask for help. To the best of my understanding, since I've only worked with a limited number of grants, and I think that's what you mean, right, is how do grants impact it? The grants, usually when they come from the federal government, have some hooks back into the federal use of that intellectual property. It doesn't mean, I think it doesn't mean that you owe them a share of the profits, a share of the royalty, but that they have the right to practice whatever it is you do. So you need to deal with your tech transfer office, and other people have kind of already thought about this situation, and it's written into the grant process. It depends on how much political capital you have in the university and how much of it you're willing to burn, and maybe if you're a tenured faculty member or not. Sometimes you need to find the general counsel in the university or some other administrator who can work with you on your behalf to get a license deal done. I've never had to do that. I've been pretty fortunate and worked with a lot of really good individuals in the tech transfer community. So I hope you don't have to do that, but yeah, you can. Just like I said, it depends on how much capital you want to burn. If you're looking to license your technology as a faculty member, the Tech Transfer Office definitely should be out trying to make introductions to companies that might want to be the licensee. That's a pretty common thing, and I know that the Tech Transfer Offices here in Houston really do go out of their way to try to find different contacts in different industries and use them to get some of the technology just licensed out of the company. And the inventor still will benefit from that. But if you are thinking of licensing your own IP, and inside the Tech Transfer Office, one of the functions that office fulfills is getting your patents prosecuted. You're expected to interact with the attorneys to provide full and fair disclosure of everything that's gone on in your invention and try to give them the best way of practicing your invention and let them write it up. That being said, if you successfully license your technology, you can ask to provide additional help in prosecuting that patent and actually take a more active role. Quite often a company will sign what's called a common interest agreement with the university that allows the company to talk to the university's patent counsel directly and help make decisions. So the company can help decide, well, this patent, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to file it in Brazil, but in Japan and Europe it's fine. Those types of issues, and to some degree the actual material in the patents, you can have input on that as well. That's a very good thing to have if you can negotiate that. I think the average patent infringement fees that a small company charges, a small company may build up, are around $3 million.
And infringement fees can vary a company.
And that's not even what happens if you're found to be infringing, or that's just the attorney's fees going into the deal. And that's kind of why I was saying that I think it's more important to make sure that you have a domain expert working with you on your patent. That's really one of the key issues that I think you need to fight for, rather than just taking somebody who's got a biology background is working on your biology patent. Make sure if you're working on a new adenovirus strain to find somebody who's an expert in adenovirus working with you. I'm sorry, I bet I mentioned that in my slide presentation, or showed it and didn't mention it. So stacking rights are something that can be really very, very important, especially if you're dealing with a therapeutic where you might, or any process where you might have to pull different pieces of intellectual property together. So if you think about your patent and you just promise the university you're going to pay them a 2% royalty, that's great. But if you need one more piece of IP to practice whatever it is you want to do, you go out and you license that, and it's another 2% you're paying somebody. Well, all of a sudden you've got a 4% royalty rate, and that might be dangerous for your business model. What you can write into your license is a stacking privileges or stacking rights term, where the university would agree to have their royalty decreased up to a certain percentage of decrease, kind of difficult way of explaining it, in the event that you license another piece of intellectual property. So, for example, your 2% royalty that you owe the university can decrease by up to 50%. So now you're paying them a 1% royalty because you have to pay someone else a royalty as well. And most universities now expect that. I think it's much more common in the life sciences space than it is in other industries, but it's a pretty important term if you can get it into your agreement. And sometimes the investors, you can use them. They can come in and say that, these economic terms, we won't invest in this company on these terms, but if you let us change it, we'll invest and you'll get your money, and that really helps get the deal done. Full and fair disclosure. Everybody should know what's going on in the game and who has an economic interest. You may not have to spell out exactly what that stake is. That might be very confidential information. But I've seen faculty members write in the bottoms of journal articles little descriptions that say, by the way, I have an economic interest in this company and in this research. Now, getting that through the university, getting the university policies changed to accept that is another issue. And the Bayh-Dole Act was 1981? 82. Okay, 82. I was close. You know, we're 26, 27 years into this, and academia changes slower than government does. I mean, that's the bottom line. So I think they're doing pretty well so far. I've seen people start negotiating when the inventor has made full disclosure to the tech transfer office. It can happen as early as that. Now, the licensee will realize that they are taking on a very big risk doing that, but hopefully they have some ability to do technical due diligence on your work, and they'll develop their own level of comfort with it. But it can be very, very early. It doesn't have to be an issued patent.